All right, so we are now technically beginning period 2, known as the classical period. And so in class we're going to talk about this a lot, but every historical time period has some common themes. And so one of our jobs as budding historians is to compare how exactly do those common themes apply to different civilizations that we focus on. And so earlier this week you watched the video to look at that intermediary period between the fall of the River Valley civilization in India to what we are going to look at today, what's known as the classical period. Before I can jump into talking about India though, we need to just look at what are these themes? What is period 2? What does that mean? And what it's really referring to is periodization. And in history, periodization is basically when historians look at the scope of history and they kind of determine turning points for, and because we're world history, they had to look globally at what were some major shifts in human development that significantly marks the beginning of one pattern of human development and the beginning of a new pattern. And obviously that's not a perfect system, because sometimes different civilizations will go through a very similar shift but at slightly different times. So for example, the Neolithic Revolution, when human beings went from being hunter-gatherers to agriculturalists, that shift happened all around the world, but it didn't necessarily happen at the same time all around the world. Some civilizations experienced it sooner or earlier than others. And so, periodization is not a perfect skill or art form, but it is part of our course. So just to remind you, we do have 6 time periods we look at. So as we begin period 2, what's the big picture? So this isn't necessarily specific just to India, but generally speaking, what are we going to be talking about? These are the big ideas we're talking about for the next 5 weeks as we look at period 2. So number 1, new belief systems will emerge and spread beyond political boundaries. So that means just because a religion such as Buddhism might begin in India, it does not necessarily mean it will remain in India. Societies will start to be organized on the basis of religious and cultural traditions. So it's not just a matter of who your ruler or leader is, but people are going to feel unified through their common culture. And we have a vocab term that we need to be familiar with because it will come up on the AP exam, and so that's known as universalizing religions. And these are religions where basically they welcome anyone to join, and not only that, but through their system of beliefs there is the promise of equality, especially in an afterlife. So the 2 universalizing religions that developed during this time period are going to be Christianity and Buddhism. Number 2, the number and size of empires is going to grow dramatically. And so we're going to see, we're not just going to have kingdoms, we're going to have massive empires. And so that means that one of the common things we're going to talk about in this time period is like, now that empires are so large, well, how do governments or rulers and leaders manage those large territories? It's a matter of dealing with environmental factors, trade, warfare, and also how do you just control people in large territories. We're going to start to see some cities grow in importance, especially as they become trade centers. And then social structures are becoming increasingly hierarchical and more complex. So, if you think about hunter-gatherers, really had no social structure. Male and females were considered equal. Both of their, tasks were considered needed for the survival of the tribe. But now when you have more specialization of labor, that means you have more jobs and specialties are created outside of agriculture, people's place in society becomes a bit more complicated. Our third big picture theme is trade, and we're going to look at the volume of long distance trade, most notably the Silk Road trade routes that come out of China and connect all the way from India across Central Asia to the Mediterranean to the Middle East. In fact, Romans will trade with Han Chinese during this time period. And then as technology develops, you're going to see Indian Ocean trade begin. Indian Ocean trade is going to really explode actually in the next time period, period 3, but we do see it start to develop in this time period. And because of a technological innovation of the invention of the camel saddle and stirrups, you're also going to start to see Bedouin tribes in the Arabian Peninsula start to conduct camel caravans, trans-Saharan trade, and those peoples will have contact with people of the Mediterranean and Asians as well through Silk Roads and Indian Ocean trade. So you're going to have a lot of exchange happening during this time period of goods, peoples, and ideas. Other big ideas that are worth making note, when historians look at this time period, there was no single event that drastically marked the beginning and end of a time period. They just saw this general shift. For example, something you're probably familiar with, World War I. World War I is seen as a very distinctive event that marked the shift that ended one time period and started another. But in this sense, we're just kind of looking at a general shift of how did human beings interact with one another to mark period 2. So what were those shifts? Again, the size of and political strength of empires, so the rise of empires. We see new religions and complex social hierarchies develop. You're going to see far more and numerous and better written records and more complex and long-distance trade. You're also going to see more contact between nomadic peoples and sedentary peoples. So nomads are pastoralists, or these are people that have kind of remained hunter-gatherers, but they do herd animals, so they're not as primitive as hunter-gatherers. Nomad, I think, is a little misleading. These people did not wander aimlessly. They actually followed their food source as they herded. So they were, they usually had a larger territory, but they would circulate season by season based on their dietary needs. And then you have sedentary people, so agriculturalists, people who settle down and start urban living cities and towns, and obviously that evolves into empires. And then you're going to see more of a connection between some of the ideas that come up during this time period and the modern day than the previous period. All right, so looking at classical India. So we have two major empires during this time period. So just a little recap. During period 1, the Aryans had migrated into the Indian subcontinent from the north of the Black Sea. Dravidians were native to the Indian subcontinent, and these two cultures had to basically figure out how they were going to live side by side. And in that configuration, you had the development of the caste system. It was a social class hierarchy and usually unchangeable status. Aryans used the phrase Varna in Sanskrit for color, and 4 major castes were based on creation myth from their Vedas. And remember, their Vedas were the religious texts. Brahmins, once again, were the highest class. These were priests and scholars, and they represented intellect and knowledge. You next had your warriors, you had your landowners, you had your Shudra, and then not technically part of the caste system, but you have your untouchables. Now clearly there's occupations that are going to evolve and be created over time that don't necessarily fit in those categories. So in order to make sure the caste system could still work, you had the creation of jati, and jati were basically subcastes that would fall under a larger caste. And again, it's all based on occupations. What is your duty? What is your daily ritual? Yeah, you only can marry within the caste. So it's a very rigid social system, but it created stability in India, and it created oftentimes unification. So right here what you're seeing is I inserted a video clip. I'm actually going to upload all these videos separately on the stream of Google Classroom, so make sure you look for those. I try to find videos that are definitely under 10 minutes of length, but that's a good video there in the caste system that I'll have you guys look at. Oh, my screen shifted. One moment. All right, so I'm back. So you have, again, it's a little bit of recap, but the Vedic age was the religious texts that were passed down from the generation to generation. The Rig Veda is the most important of the Vedas. Reincarnation is the central belief and rebirth of the soul, and eventually these beliefs came to be called Hinduism, a religion of most people that live today in the Indian subcontinent. So Hinduism is actually considered a belief system that come out of period 1. So if you remember just a minute ago, I said our two major religions that we're going to see during this time period are Buddhism and Christianity. So Buddhism, we're going to look at a little bit more detail a bit later, but Buddhism was developed during this time period. It is the second major world religion, founded by Siddhartha Gautama. I think I spelled that wrong. Anyways, he was actually born into a wealthy family, a ruling family. He had a very privileged life, and he's going to be pretty shocked by some of the suffering he sees, and so he's going to turn to meditation. And so this is going to develop, and it's going to be pretty popular initially, especially with people in the lower caste system, because Buddhism did not believe in the caste system. So obviously if you're in a lower caste, that would be appealing. But we're going to have the rise of the Mauryan dynasty. And the most significant leader of that dynasty was Ashoka, and he's actually the grandson of the initial dynastic leader. He's going to adopt Buddhism. We'll look at him in a bit more detail in a moment. So Buddhism will surge in popularity while he rules, but eventually, and I'll explain why soon, people are going to shift back to Hinduism, and Buddhism is really going to spread along the Silk Road trade routes, and in the long run, Buddhism is actually going to be far more popular in China, and Japan, and Korea, and even Southeast Asia than it ever is in India, where it was actually founded. Alright, like I said, I'll get this all down in a moment. All these slides moving around everywhere. So the Mauryan dynasty continued. So what happened? So this was the first dynasty to actually unify the majority of the Indian subcontinent. So you may remember in the earlier videos I had mentioned that India was always very difficult to unify due to its geography. Transportation and communication was extremely difficult. As a result, various languages and local cultural traditions developed across the subcontinent. So what made centralization possible? It's going to be the caste system. You know, despite having maybe differences in some traditions and in language, the one thing that all people in the Indian subcontinent really adhered to was that caste system. So when the Mauryan dynasty is established, they're going to be able to build their rule from that caste system that was already in place. You also had they had the benefit of shared religious beliefs since they were practicing Hindus. The dynasty first came to rule from the kingdom of Magadha. So I believe in a later slide there's a video, but there's a pretty good map that's kind of towards that kingdom is generally along the Ganges River toward the eastern part of the subcontinent. The dynasty grew from there, beginning with their founder Chandragupta Maurya. And as mentioned above, it's really going to be his son or grandson Ashoka who's going to be considered the leader of the height of this empire. So how does he rule? He actually comes into rule as a fairly young man. He was very ambitious, pretty violent actually. He's going to use the imperial army to conquer all the surrounding kingdoms to establish his empire. And then he's going to establish a pretty strong bureaucracy to manage his empire. So remember, a bureaucracy is when you actually hire government officials to act as administrators of your rules and customs, as tax collectors, and they all report back to a central government. And so he's going to establish that system, and that's part of how he is going to be able to unify India. It's going to be one of the last kingdoms that he finally defeats, the kingdom of Kalinga, and it was an extremely bloody battle, and he's going to be shocked. He's going to really be appalled by the death and destruction that he sees. Maybe I'm a little cynical. I think it's convenient of him to face that reality when he basically conquered his last major kingdom. Why he did not come to this realization earlier on, I'm not quite sure. But this is usually considered the midpoint of his political career. And during this time, he's going to be so shocked, and he's going to start to turn to Buddhism, because Buddhism emphasized peace, tolerance, and nonviolence. And he's actually going to convert from Hinduism to Buddhism during this time. His dominant image in Indian history as a result is that he was a young warrior prince turned responsible monarch who saw himself as the father of his people. During this time, there was a proliferation of government-sponsored Buddhist monasteries and monumental art. And as you can see there, that last link is actually I have a hyperlink to look at some of the Buddhist stupas and art and architecture that was created during this time period. Again, I will filter that out to you guys later through Google Classroom. But one of the things you do have to be fairly familiar with is how did rulers use monumental architecture to enhance their rule. So here is a Crash Course World History, so I will also feed that through on Google Classroom. So the fall of the Mauryans. It lasted for quite a time after his death. However, he is considered the strongest ruler, and after his death it kind of marked a trend in general decline. Central Asians are going to make their ways through the mountains to the north, and they're going to start to invade, and basically India for about 350 years and we go back to being ununified, where you have a bunch of regional kingdoms. So you'll have different governments, different leaders, but you'll still have that cultural tie of the caste system in Hinduism. Unfortunately, these invaders will start to adopt Buddhism. I say unfortunately, it's nothing personal. I guess it's unfortunate for the people that believed in Buddhism. So what ends up happening is now Buddhism, even despite being founded in India, will start to seem like a foreign religion, and so a lot of Buddhist converts will return to their Hindu belief system. So then our second major Indian empire during this time period is the Guptas. They will be the second dynasty to unify India during the classical period. Their empire will not be quite as large as the Mauryas, but they will be significant. They were founded by Chandragupta. He actually adopted his name from the previous Chandragupta to rename his empire. They also initiated out of the Magadha kingdom in the east. Did not create a bureaucracy though, and that's going to be something that's unique. Remember, one of the skills we have to do in this class is compare and contrast. And so we're going to see bureaucracy creep up in the Mediterranean, such as Rome. We're going to see bureaucracy in China, what we're going to look at next week. But Gupta does not create a bureaucracy. In fact, he actually allowed local rulers to still maintain a lot of their local traditions. So how was it unified? He basically demanded taxes and tribute payments from these people. So he's going to have, I say he, but his family and his dynasty is going to have a bit of a looser rule than we've seen in previous dynasties. The decline of the Gupta, 500 Common Era, so 500 CE, they're going to be invaded by what we call the White Huns, so out of present-day Afghanistan and Pakistan. Local princes also began to resist those tributary payments and taxes, so you'll have basically political decline will spread across India. And then we're going to see next in the next time period, period 3, that you're going to have the birth of Islam, and then you're going to start to have a Muslim caliphate establish itself in India due to Gupta decline. So despite the political decline that happens with the Gupta India, they had a lot of notable accomplishments, and this is also known as like the Indian golden age during this time period. And golden age is a historical phrase that tends to get used for a lot of different areas. And so just generally speaking, what does it mean? It's a period of cultural growth, accomplishments, and intellectual innovations. So this can include art, religion, science, literature, and math. And you should have read through the Persia portion of the summer assignment, but Alexander the Great is going to spread Hellenistic or Greek influences across Asia. And so because of Alexander the Great, Indian scientists and mathematicians are going to encounter Greek philosophy and sciences, and this is going to lead to a lot of innovation on behalf of India. In fact, I found this cool little video. Again, I'll have to post it on Google Classroom, but what we call Arabic numbers are technically Indian numbers, and so they made a lot of advancements in the math and sciences during this time period. They also established an education system where they had universities with lecture halls, an observatory, so basically for astronomy, to study the stars. Religion, the religious belief led to a lot of architectural developments such as stupas, so the Buddhist temples, paintings. They built lavish courtyards, sculptures. There's also a lot of caves with Hindu wall paintings and arts as well. Literature, Sanskrit is the language of the educated, and so there's going to be this huge outpouring of epic poems during this time period from India. Again, another short video of monumental architecture. Medicine, they started to experiment with, basic forms of surgery. They understood sterilization and, centuries before the Europeans. So the idea of, they didn't know exactly what germs were, but they understood the importance of cleaning wounds. They even experimented with some basic forms of plastic surgery and resetting bones, especially like after wars and battles. They never did full dissections to study the human body, and a lot of that was due to the Hindu beliefs in reincarnation. Trade, they are going to help strengthen the Silk trade routes between China, the routes that ran from China to the Mediterranean. So Indian belief systems, so I said that we would talk about these a little deeper, but Hinduism, its historical roots are grounded in the caste system. It evolved over thousands of years, blending early religions of the Aryans and Dravidians. So as I mentioned earlier, this is technically a period 1 religion. They did emphasize that there's some sort of universal spirit. They didn't necessarily label it like God, but I guess it might be a similar concept. Each person has karma, and this is why people adhered to the caste system. So what is karma? It's your destiny that has been shaped by years of cause and effect, revealed by a person's station in life. So, for example, say you're one of those untouchables, one of the worst people of society. Well, the way they looked at it, you must have done something horrible in your previous life, hence you deserve to be there. And people believe that, and the only way to get out of that station in life is to fulfill your duties, and then you hope in your next life you're born into a better caste. So you can see how this caste system actually created social stability. If people wanted a better opportunity in their next life, as they believe they can have, well, you had to follow your duties in your current life. So that inherently creates stability. And so the word for those duties is dharma. So Veda was the religious doctrines, and due to the caste system when Buddhism first emerged, it's going to definitely appeal to people of the lower caste. So now looking at Buddhism. So Buddhism did emerge during period 2. The Enlightenment that Buddhism preaches about is that you experience this while you're meditating, and the original Buddha is said to have reached this enlightened state while meditating under a Bodhi tree, and that became the heart of the religious beliefs. Initially, Buddhists did not consider him a god. He was just a man that reached that level of enlightenment. In this belief system, everyone, regardless of your caste, could attain nirvana, and that was through meditation, the enlightenment, and it was considered this union with the universal spirit, which would offer a release from human suffering. And so this is why this is known as a universalizing religion, that no matter what caste you're from, you have the same capability of reaching through meditation that spiritual nirvana. Well, how do you attain that? It's reached through the understanding of the Four Noble Truths, so these 4 laws that they adhere to, and the Eightfold Path is basically 8 rules that you live by in order to fulfill those 4 Noble Truths. Popular under the sponsorship of Ashoka, is spread rapidly along trade routes and blended with other ideas, and is going to form 2 major variations. And so these are actually what you see today, because while Buddhism is still practiced in India today, it's not it's practiced much more widely in other areas. So you have Theravada Buddhism. This is known as the narrower vehicle. It was a stricter version of the faith. It emphasized a monastic life. So monasticism, we'll see that occur in many of our universalizing religions. You have monasticism in Christianity, Buddhism, we'll see it later in Islam. And this basically means is when people give up the luxuries of life and live very simply, eat simply to show their devotion to their faith. Claims to be the pure form of the Buddha's teaching. They do not believe the Enlightened One or Buddha was anything other than a mortal man. And this will spread mostly through Southeast Asia, but remains relatively small. What most, I would say, Buddhists, the category they fall under are Mahayana. And this is known as syncretism. And syncretism is a key term you have to know all year when you have basically a religion or any kind of cultural element. You can even see with food spread from one area to another, but it blends with local customs. So Mahayana is known as the great vehicle. It grew to encompass most Buddhist. Significant concept is Bodhisattva, a person who had taken the Eightfold Path and reached perfection, but had delayed entering Nirvana in order to help others along the way. And this group actually began to worship Buddha as a god, and this is what you see more commonly in China and Japan. So that basically is where we leave off with looking at classical India. Thank you.